reverse the symbolic weightings of key terms. Take a negative and turn it into a positive. So you got to let them lead the dance. And you've got to learn how to get in step, get in sync with the rhythm of their moves. If not, then you're violating a fundamental ethical principle of hermeneutic, justice, and patience and generosity. Give the writer his or her say. Learn to dance with them. Learn how to get a step. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing. It's you've got to give them their say. Open yourself up to them. Now, so this was a central concern. And King said, look, I'm not talking about erotic love. I'm talking about agape love. So part of it is getting worked out, what do we mean by love? So let's talk this through. We call it dialogue. Listening, asking questions prior to rendering final judgments, being open to the possibility of changing oneself. Well, you said something, yeah, but I thought you meant, no, that's not what I mean. Oh, but I understand you thought, but here's what, oh, I misspoke. Oh, I misheard. Okay, well, let's try it again. That process is crucial to having a stable, viable community. Well, what do we mean? In some sense, we call it democracy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. Today is a really special episode, also a very challenging episode for many different reasons. It is with Lucius Outlaw, and he was going to tell you about his journey from growing up in a segregated small town in Mississippi to becoming a philosophy professor, a very well-respected one who knows everyone. He's been in the same room with everyone from Eric Fromm to Martin Luther King Jr. to many of the leaders of today, as you'll hear in this conversation. And we're also talking about one of my favorite philosophers, who is W.E.B. Du Bois, who came up with this phrasing double consciousness, which you've probably heard me talk about in other episodes. For example, with Mina Salami, we talked about double consciousness and extending that into thinking about it through the ecological world. We also talk about Hegel, someone you hear me talk about a lot here, and the idea of holding paradox, of course, but this doubling, this idea of the third space or stepping to the third way in order to see the two sides that have seemed oppositional. Hegel might be discussed as doing this through synthesis or the dialectic, and Du Bois is talking about these two kind of seemingly irreconcilable notions of self that one often experiences, the self of your first person phenomenological experience, and then the way you're perceived by those around you. It's a kind of two-ness, an inward two-ness, which is also part of your social relation because of however the society around you is defining you. There's a lot of links to that, to Hegel, of course, but also to other writers I love like Emerson. And Du Bois was also studying at Humboldt in Berlin for a little while, which is where I did my degrees too. So there's a lot of connections here, and even more so, one reason I really wanted to talk with Lucius, not only just because I wanted him to tell a story, which is really what this is, because it's very interesting. You know, there's also Nikki Giovanni makes an appearance, but also because he brought phenomenology together with Du Bois, which is something, I think Du Bois was already doing phenomenology, and he had studied it in Germany. He knew about it. But in Lucius Outlaw's work, he discusses this directly. In phenomenology, that we could do a whole episode on that. In fact, someone asked me to do a research diary, and I will. But just for purposes here, it's when you study consciousness or our experience of consciousness from the first person point of view, from the point of view of how you experience it. So you're really looking at the structure of that ongoing dynamical experience that you're having or that one is having and taking that seriously. And there's these names which like Husserl, Edmund Husserl, or Sartre, or Merleau-Ponty is very important. The person I work with in Heidelberg, Thomas Fuchs, we did a nice talk together. He's coming out of that tradition in Germany, and also with like Karl Jaspers was at the Universität Heidelberg, which is where I am. So there's all these connections which you don't need to care about, but what's important for this discussion is that Lucius brought together Du Bois and phenomenology, and he did that through the work of Alfred Schutz. He did this all the way back in his dissertation, which we talk about here. And Alfred Schutz was a phenomenologist who also brought some different threads together, because he brought the work of Edmund Husserl together with the work of Max Weber, or Max Weber, you might know the name. And this connects to other ideas like sense-making, participatory sense-making, relational philosophy, process philosophy. A lot of these are different turns of the kaleidoscope towards trying to understand how we are part of one ongoing process. We also have individual experiences. Those are co-created by everything that we're interacting with, by what we call our social environment or our ecological world. And how do we understand this? That it's just going on all the time. We're separate, but we're also never separate. You probably remember some of these themes from discussions with Ezekiel DePaulo and Marco and Hannah de Jaeger and Rebecca Todd, Shea Welch, Elena Kufari, Evan Thompson for sure. So in different ways, a lot of these philosophers and neuroscientists and thinkers have been trying to understand this, how we are first person, we are having individual experience, coming into awareness of it, and also doing that in a social, relational, ecological process. And Lucius, in this discussion, discusses it from the angle of W.E.B. Du Bois and the experience that he had when he wrote The Souls of Black Folk, for example, which he wrote in 1903, by the way, where he was already reading all of this phenomenology, but also Emerson and Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit. And I find this phenomenology of double consciousness just so helpful, and I really hope that more can think about it in our academic work and write about it and read Du Bois and also read Lucius Outlaw and his writing. We don't want to lose narratives in that perspective, and it also opens up other worlds if we can sit with it and try to understand it as part of the life world that we're hoping to be able to expand enough to fill into, to understand is connected to all of us. So all that said, and that's a bit clumsy because, I just talk when I turn on the mic for these intros, because that's just this podcast. But this is also just a difficult conversation because of where we are right now in terms of how we are able to talk about these kinds of subjects. It's hard also because his internet kept going out. I think we talked for 3 hours and there were huge pauses and so much trouble with the audio. And we actually had this conversation a year ago, and it's taken me that long just to be able to get through it and actually get it into a presentable enough audio form that I can put it online and that you can actually listen to it. So this has just been, quite the challenge in so many different ways. Also, as you'll hear, just the subjects are really tough. If you feel like you're ready, please do listen. If you don't, that's okay. I do hope you'll go look at W.E.B. Du Bois and double consciousness, though. Think about the philosophy of that, and especially in relation to something like Dialectic and Hegel and other threads of phenomenology. All of that we talk about here, and Lucius has some really interesting things about Hegel, for example. Think about that word double consciousness, this doubling that is actually not a doubling at all if we can begin to understand thinking and consciousness in a more kaleidoscopic way. That's a word I use a lot, or as a constellation. And this whole research channel is documenting people who are trying to do that from different directions and different ways. And this is another one, a very important one, I think, to bring in W.E.B. Du Bois, again, double consciousness, the work of the philosopher Lucius Outlaw, who you will hear discuss here. You will hear him discuss his work here. How that relates to Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Hegel. I'll try to do some separate videos on all these different topics for those who are coming to it new. Don't worry if you've never heard any of these words. I mean, this is just a little tiny corner of the universe. There are many others, but the things we're trying to understand here are, and that all of these people I've mentioned are trying to understand, are how we are individuals and part of the world at the same time, and what that means and what consciousness is and how we can live it more fully, more sensually, and perhaps even begin to open up new worlds for one another of love, I hope, and of care, which is where this conversation goes in the end, connecting to Martin Luther King Jr. and that whole spirit of love that I feel we really need right now. It's still here. Don't be afraid to feel it and notice it and live out of it. It's really needed, and it's really part of us. And it's really a wonderful way to live when you can live from love. So it's not always easy, but it's worth the persistence. Thanks for being here.
Hello, Lou. Good morning. So good to see you.
Likewise, Leander, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Have a discussion.
So there's so much about your work I want to talk about, as I was just telling you. But I think to start, let's start in Mississippi in 1944.
So I was born and grew up in a small town in Mississippi, Starkville, which is sort of east central Mississippi. It's about 6 miles south of Tupelo, Mississippi, 120 miles slightly northeast of the capital in Jackson, Mississippi, in an area called the Golden Triangle. There's a state institution there, Mississippi State University, which was segregated at the time I was growing up. The first Negro knowingly admitted was in summer of around 1965, was actually one of my best friends and classmates who integrated Mississippi State University in the summer. I was an only child. My mother said she prayed and made a promise to God, and if he gave her a child, she'd give it back to him. So as a consequence, I spent more time in war. We grew up in Baptist churches, and I never have to spend the rest of my life, thanks to my mother, which led to her making sure that I was in a lot of churches for most of my life. My mother did day work, mostly in the homes of white families, cleaning, as a maid. And my father was the janitor of a large white Baptist church, the First Baptist Church. We were members of Second Baptist Church, which was what we called a colored or Negro church in Starkville. And it was, as I was growing up, of course, you've got to be trained early on in the rules, the laws, the unwritten law norms and protocols of hierarchic racial segregation and order around Negroes and white people, et cetera, superiority and inferiority and all of that. So, you grow up in that context. And for a great deal of normal everyday life, in a sort of segregated world, interestingly, you might think that a segregated, racially segregated Mississippi has really very sharp boundaries, physical boundaries between black folk and what we now say, black folk, colored people, etc. I was born on one side of town on one street, and we moved when I was 4 years old. It was on West Main Street, which is the West End Main Street in Starkville. If you would leave my house and go downtown, there would be a block of West Main, which would intersect with Long Street. On the other side of Long Street, that was a boulevard with a divider in the middle, one way up and one way down. That was a block long. That block was all white homes. But when you got past that block, you would go down a hill, another block. One half of that block to the right, there were white homes. The other half of that block were colored homes. And the next block, on the right side of that block, was the back of the white Methodist church. On the left side of that block, the colored Methodist church and a couple of Negro businesses. And then you were in the next block, there were all these businesses downtown. But if you turned left into that block, it was the beginning of a whole colored neighborhood. So my point is, the proximity of colored white people together was, you could walk across one street, you're in a white neighborhood, across another street, you're in a colored neighborhood. If I went to Long Street and turned right, all those houses to the next were white homes. If I turned left, all those houses were colored homes. So there were divisions by streets and et cetera. But it could be as subtle as one house here is white, the next house is colored. So it's kind of interesting. But as I grew up and was going to school, one of the striking things is, okay, why are there different churches? There's one God, everybody shows out, okay, right. And so, my father's working in this big white church, and I was working at that same church, cleaning the building where that served as the nursery school, et cetera. By the time I was older and in high school, having discussion with my father about this, he would often say the church where he worked was pretty much failed on Sundays. He took that as a kind of measure of the commitment to faith of these white people, etc. You say, Negroes need to go to church. Look at the white people go to church, and etc. There's me son saying, I said, well, they fill at the church on Sunday, but they're going to call me nigger on Monday. So I don't see why that's doing much good. The church is serving. I'm still going to be called by many of them on Monday. So I was just never convinced. Yeah. And of course, that again to trouble him because when I was in high school, he was like, I don't think it's going to get you in trouble. I got in trouble in school for challenging the principal about something. The principal got really upset and sent me out of the office and called my father over to the school. And the assistant principal was a cousin of my father, and they called me down to the office. And the issue had been when James Meredith integrated the University of Mississippi was a big deal. There were federal troops brought in and et cetera. And it happened over a weekend. And actually studying about where some white students in Springfield were protesting that Meredith had been in Mississippi. So they were marching through towns, neighborhoods, protesting. And my mother and I had been driving my mother to a church function and was coming back, and we ran into them. And at first I couldn't figure out, why is there a parade on Sunday on the highway? She was like, get out of here, turn around, quickly, turn around. So we had to take a different route home and got home and found out what they were protesting. Well, the next day in school, one of my classmates was the principal's granddaughter. So she was arguing that, they shouldn't have been going to the schools. Negroes need to stay in their place. And mine was, my dad pays taxes as a state school. We should have, so much right to go to the state school as anybody else. So she got really upset. Went downstairs to the principal's office to her grandfather and told the grandfather what I had said. But we're sitting in this classroom. The principal comes over into the comm to that class and says, Miss Stewart, is Mr. Outlaw in your class? Yes, he's a. Have him come to the office. And she looked at me. She's like, Lucius, why can't you just keep quiet? I got to go down to the office where the principal and the assistant principal are giving me a hard time with my father.
Oh,
well, just not having it, I simply would not back down. And actually, there was a maternal uncle who was the principal of the elementary school at that time, who lived with us on weekdays and would go home to the country on weekends. He was the principal of the middle school, so he stayed with us doing weekdays while he was serving as principal. He went home to the country on weekends. So when I got home in the afternoon, he and my father and my mother were sort of in the living room, getting on me about, dealing with this explosive issue. And I just wasn't having it, And so my father was like, your mouse is going to get you in trouble. So he sort of feared, I was going to get into trouble. He was always advising me to leave these political matters alone. They would get worked out. Shouldn't be pushing it. So I just was never convinced about that strategy, though I sort of followed it in one sense. That is, I didn't deliberately go around protesting, doing things, but I was sort of a rebel in my own mind, and I just never accepted those terms were appropriate or should be accepted.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. You were already philosophizing in a way, but it's interesting too, because what you said sounds like was the comment. I mean, like it was just looking at things the way they are, but your dad and mom, I gather, were worried that if you said like something like that in the wrong context, you would be in a lot of danger. So it was kind of a protective thing, right? Not that the people didn't agree with you necessarily, but or do I misunderstand?
No, that's right. And remember, I am what they call, I'm a member of the Emmett Till generation. So when Emmett Till was killed, supposedly for being first with a white woman, impacted and conditioned my life forever and a day.
Mm-hmm. Parents looked at you and didn't want that to happen to you. So there was probably a huge amount of, how do we protect our son in this world that's not fair at all?
Yeah. So that was part of it. One of the significant things that happened one day, my father and I were downtown on Main Street, and we were walking west of Green Street together. There was an older white man on the sidewalk walking east. He was walking directly towards us.
Mm-hmm.
He walked up to my father and moved over the boy and let a white man pass. And my father never raised his voice. He just looked at him directly and said, "I am not a boy. You are not disrespect me in front of my son."
Wow.
And the white man just sort of lowered his eyes and then stepped around my father and went on. And my father never ever said anything to me about that encounter. He never said a word to me about it. And I witnessed it all. We never discussed it. I never ever forgot it. And I came to understand something about the nature of the man that my father was. I mean, he wasn't going to get involved in protests. He didn't want me to be involved in protests. He was trying to figure out what words you might say. For him, it was going to all get worked out in time. Like he had a brother, for example, there were other black people who left and went north because they thought life was going to be better in the north. He had a brother who had done that. And his thing was, I don't think there's anything special about the north. It's going to really get worked out in the south better than the way in the north. And for him, he was a gradualist, right? And he didn't believe in direct confrontation and stuff like that. In the meantime, he had developed a several things. One is he was clear to himself about who he was, and he was not going to be disrespected. He accommodated certain kinds of things, but he was not going to accommodate disrespect. But he wasn't going to be involved in protest. So he was an interesting strategist about how he negotiated the entire situation. I mean, he said to me once, he said, son, what you've got to learn to do is you've got to learn to handle people with get love. You've got to learn to persuade them to do what you want to do. And I watched him on a number of occasions do that. I mean, there was a way in which if he were shopping for something like a new television, the white person that he knew really well says, "I got to have a new TV." He's like, "Okay." He says, "Well, I can only pay so much for the TV." And it's like, "Well, Lucius, I'm sorry."
Yeah, I lost you again. Lucius, that's the last thing I heard about the TV.
The businessman would say, "Well, Lucius, I'm sorry. This is what it's costing." My father was just quietly saying, "Yeah, I understand, but I can only pay so much." And he would sit there and continue this back and forth if it took 2 hours. And eventually the white man would say, "Oh, God. All right, Lucius. Yes, you can have it for that price." "Well, thank you very much." And then they'd arrange for the delivery. And he would get what he needed, but he would simply continue softly, gently to negotiate. "I'm sorry, I can't do that. I need a loan. My son is going to college. Got to have this mortgage. I got a second mortgage. I've got to have this loan." Revolution. "Well, no, I can't pay that much. Now, here's what I can pay." And he would get the terms that he could meet. And that was part of the way in which he worked. And he was very highly respected. The other thing was he learned, and I learned through him and Harrison, our red white group, is that not all white people are the same. The distinctions that I grew up with was there are good white people and there are bad white people. You need to know which ones are the good white people because they can make a difference between life and death. Which ones are bad you should avoid. We would say now, well, who are the white people that are really racist? Who are the white people that are less racist? Who are some of them are not really racist, et cetera? You have to learn those distinctions about people and develop relations and et cetera with them. And that was something that I learned growing up. But again, the whole thing didn't make sense. So I went off to college, majored in philosophy of religion because I was originally going to go into the ministry of myself sophomore year. Finally reached the conclusion, religious stuff weren't making sense with me, and I'm not doing the God thing anymore. Which made a real break with my mother.
Yeah, I was about to say, I bet your mom was not happy.
Oh, happy is not the word. She was distraught. So I had written her a letter back, and I got one of those letters from her, sort of, "Dear, oh my God," sort of, metaphorically, still staying letters. "What are you doing? Why did I send you to a place with atheists?" and blah, 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 blah. So I go home at the end of that academic year, and one evening, I noticed she's dressing when she gets dressed to go out. There's nothing to do at night. There's no clubs. My father didn't go out drinking or anything like that. And it's not Wednesday, so it's not prayer meeting at church. So where is she going? If she gets dressed and there's a knock at the door. She goes to the door and opens it. My father's working in the yard, and she opens the door. It's our minister. She sort of steps out and says, there he is. I'm sitting in the living room watching television. The minister comes in and she leaves. And I was thinking to myself, okay, this is what this is about. But he's not going to win this argument. So the minister comes in and we talk. I don't remember anything about what we talked about. I don't remember anything from the conversation. The only memory I have is my mother returns. The minister gets up and starts to leave. He gets to the door and he says, he's putting on his hat and he says to my mom on her way out the door, there's nothing wrong with the boy. Leave him alone. And he walks out the door. Now, there's a whole bunch in the background about my relationship with this minister and all of that in my life, blah, blah, blah. But, I had made up my mind. And then, my mother was still distraught. And one time I finally said to her, I said, look, God and I have made a deal. He doesn't mess with me. I don't mess with him. She now cried. So I literally stayed away from home for about 2 years. I just said, I'm not dealing with this. I said to her, look, I'm going to live my life on my own terms. I'm not going to live my life on the basis of a deal you made with God. You don't make deals. I'm going to live them on my terms. You can't pray me into heaven. You can make the deal, but I'm not going to live that deal.
Yeah.
This is my life. Now, this time I'm studying philosophy. I'd had a course in existentialism. It was interesting. When you're reading Sartre and about freedom and etc., talking with classmates about this. And it was actually a classmate who said, you don't have to do this religious stuff you don't want to. And I'm like, I can. I have to. He's like, no, you don't. You can choose. And I sort of had a breakdown and cry. I was like, yeah, you're right. I have to do this anymore. I'm not doing this. I hated it anyway. I'm not doing this preaching stuff. God called me to do this. I'm just not doing it. My life, I'm living it on my own terms, period.
Really not easy thing to come to. I mean, all of us trying to, what our parents want for us, it can be hard to go against it. But this is like really hard because your mom sounds like from the beginning, almost your health in her mind and your it was almost like she was worried if you didn't do what she'd promised God, then like she would fear for you or something.
And for his
Oh, wow.
So there's a whole bunch of stuff built into this seventh son business.
Whoa, yeah.
To deal with, right? The seventh son, a gift from God. Yeah, okay. But I'm not going to play the God game anymore. I'm out. I'm taking myself out of there. And so it was years later, she was working at a local 2-year college. I was invited down to give a talk. So my wife and I and our baby, firstborn son and her first grandchild, we go down and I give this talk and we're back in her apartment later and we just sort of lounge around the apartment. Said to me, she said, after listening to you tonight, I realized there's a lot of different ways you could minister out there. And I said, And by this time I had, while I was at Fisk, my freshman year, one of the things that was happening in Nashville was that the nonviolent direct action sit-in movement was still very much underway. Now, my parents, so Martin Luther King Jr. came to the campus to speak one Sunday. I'm at Nashville at Fisk University.
Du Bois went. Very famous place.
Yeah, Du Bois went there. My sophomore year, I'm living in Du Bois Hall. King comes as speaker, and the jail is packed. I go here, Martin Luther King Jr. There's demonstrations going on every day. People are marching downtown, sitting in, etc. My parents said, don't get involved in this. It could be dangerous for you. It could be dangerous for us. If people are out back here, we could lose our jobs, etc., etc.
This was early 60s, around 60.
I went to Fisk in 1960, so this is 63, 64 year. So, there was one day that, I had classmates, people in my dorm who were going out demonstrating, they get arrested. The university would call and raise money, get them out on bail. They'd come back, taking showers, singing freedom songs, and going right back out on the street. And one day I was spending I started watching as they were marching off, and I couldn't go, and I was just sort of standing there crying, and I just said, okay, if I can't be in the street now, I can figure out how to devote my life to supporting this and being a part of this in a different way.
That's very powerful. You said you could do it another way. You could, that connects very well with what your mom ended up eventually seeing too, and the way you think about teaching. And that was that moment, right?
Yeah, because I mean, there was kind of coalescence of a couple of realizations. So I'm living on this campus where a lot of faculty live. It's an interracial faculty, international faculty. It was a place where a number of persons who were European and Jewish and escaping the Holocaust came to the United States and joined us. So my professor of German was a person who was escaping from the Holocaust. There were people from India on the faculty, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Europe, white American faculty members, people living on the campus, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this really interesting little oasis of integration in a racially segregated city and state. But it was a private institution, so it could do things that a state-based historically Black institution couldn't do. So it was this really interesting place. And again, when I looked at how faculty who taught there but also lived on the campus, and came to me like, this isn't just a job, this is a way of life. And I was really intrigued by the intellectual life stuff, which is why I started paying attention more to academic philosophy, because I just found it intellectually very intriguing. I was trying to figure out how to make sense out of stuff. So I was like, oh, maybe these are people who make sense out of things. I'm going to study this philosophy thing, but I also want to become a college or university professor. And so it's like, okay, then here's a way in which I can take up this endeavor of speaking justice and et cetera, and I can do it perhaps as a teacher. And so that sort of became my life commitment by the time I was sophomore heading into junior year. This is where I'm going.
That's beautiful because it reminds me of your time at Haverford, where you were kind of living that life in a way, but we'll get to that. But I took you away from, you were about to say about Martin Luther King, and I really want to hear about that. So this is this time period at Fisk, and he came to speak.
Yeah, so he spoke in the gym on a Sunday night, and, I'm there, and it's a packed place. I go back to my dorm, I'm sitting around with, friends, we're probably talking about, here's something, he's this historic figure already, because this is 1960s, early 1960s. So someone started yelling out on the hallway, "Hey, Lucius," at the time, there was like one phone on each hallway, a pay telephone. So someone started yelling, "Hey, Lucius," the phone, was ringing. Somebody didn't answer the phone. And so I said, "Hey, Lucius, the phone for you is your mother." I'm like, okay, so I go take the phone. It's my mother, who has heard by way of one of their powerful radio stations in Nashville or somehow that Martin Luther King Jr. has been in nationalist up at Fisk University. She was calling, "Don't you get involved in this." So that was one of the complicating factors, that, okay, I will not do what they say, but I will make a commitment to figure out how to do this differently and better. And so that's what got me started down this road. And of course, at some point, I don't remember what year, I read early chapters of, The Souls of Black Folk is one of the texts that anchors my dissertation.
By Du Bois. So were your parents, did they talk about Du Bois?
That happened while I was in college. The whole time I was in high school, I knew nothing about Du Bois in high school. There was nothing that, there were things that was happening. Like my mother was very active in church things, and so she would do certain things like, for example, one of the popular songs that we would sing at church meetings, stuff was Kumbaya. And so my mother would use that song, church dramatizations, as how it was a coded message that slaves would use to say, "Hey, come back here, we're going to be over here in the secret place." But there was no active history month stuff going on in my school. I didn't learn the Negro national anthem in school. I basically put it as my wife, when we would be taking road trip, would teach our sons the song, and that's how I came to learn the song, where she learned it in school. We didn't learn it in school. I mean, the principal just didn't allow that kind of stuff to go on in our schools. And so it was a very complicated and interesting place. So Fisk was a very pivotal, impactful place. I mean, it set me off on a course of life. I mean, it was a very demanding place, academic, right? For example, I had a classmate who go to boarding schools in New England. They had no colored people went
Wow.
the boarding schools. His father was a multimillionaire. I didn't know there was a Negro millionaire. So here's this kid, father's a millionaire. He'd gone to boarding schools in New England. He'd had a sister graduating from Fisk. His father, I think, may even have been on the board of trustees or something like that. So a very wealthy family. After our first semester of our first year, at the beginning of the second semester, word was speculating that, hey, did you hear about so-and-so and so? That, what do you mean? He's like, he's not here anymore. I was like, what do you mean he's not here anymore? It's like, he punched out. Punched out was the expression where he's failed academically. So he's been expelled.
What? Whoa.
Father's a millionaire. He went to boarding school. His sisters are graduate, and they have expelled him for academic shortcomings. Okay, my father's a janitor, never went to college. My mother's a maid, never went to college. They are not wealthy, so the only way I'm going to stay at Fisk is I got to get my work done. Got it. So I busted my butt. I mean, for 4 years between Monday and Thursday, I probably never went to bed before 1, 2, or 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I studied so because they would put you out for academic reasons. No apologies, no questions, no matter who your mother was, who your father was.
Mhm.
You didn't perform. The joke among students was, if you didn't perform up to par academically, the university would give you a comic book, a banana, and a one-way bus ticket home. So it was a very demanding place academically, but intellectually very stimulating. I had very powerful teachers, black and white. And so I just got enamored with that academic intellectual life. Became a participant in the honors program. It was even more intensive and demanding. And I was in classes with students, particularly women, who was just, oh, smart. And I ended up having to develop a whole new appreciation for women pretty and sexually attractive. If that's the only way you approach them, there was something laughing in your face. I mean, they were like, you gotta be kidding. You know, rather than, what are you reading lately? And it's like, oh, okay. So it was a really, really interesting environment to be in. And so there was a whole kind of, there became for me a kind, competitiveness is not the right word, but there were peers and upper class persons, the women and men. I mean, the 4 years I was at Fisk, the 4 years women were president of student government. I mean, you know, so when I was back on the faculty, it was like, oh, we got a female student government the first time. Like, no. That's not the first time. 2 to 4 years I was here as a student, women were president of school. There were lots of women. Part of the reputation, the first time I heard of this was from a young guy who was studying at American Baptist Seminary. And I was talking about where I wanted to go to school, and I was thinking about going to our historically black institution, Tennessee A&I State University in Nashville. And he said, well, you can't study philosophy there, but you can do it at this place called Fisk. And I was like, oh, and he says, and by the way, they have the most beautiful black women in the world. My first day on the campus I saw exactly what it meant. And and my first week there, when upper class women came in, I went to the dining center to have dinner, was always on Sunday at midday. And I was sitting in there, and all these upper class women started walking in. At that time, there was a dress code. So on Sundays, you had to dress up to go to dinner. You couldn't wear jeans and shorts or whatever as a female on Sundays. That wasn't allowed. And I was sitting there, and these women were walking into that dining center. I couldn't eat. I had never witnessed anything like that.
This sounds like such a rich time, and also
It was
like within a really rich social and political time. It's interesting
But
thinking
so-
about what you said about your dad, about that story you told of him having this kind of poise and this way of being strong and committed, and at the same time, I mean, when did you start to be able to step back and take perspective in that way? I'm still trying to figure out how you even got to Fisk. You just kind of said it a little bit, but you already wanted to study philosophy, but you were going to go for religion too, so you were already kind of combining those.
But part of my commitment was I was not going to go to a Negro school in Mississippi. That was out for me. I simply wasn't going to do that. I wanted out of Mississippi.
Okay.
And my father says he had recommended Morehouse, but Morehouse was all male. He said, I rejected it because I had said, I don't remember this. He said, I'm not going to any school that doesn't have girls in it. When I get to Fisk, there was just this enormously powerful place, this residential community, teachers who cared, and teachers who were really demanding. I mean, the institution was really demanding, and they made no apologies on it. I mean, there was an operative sense that Fisk was producing a talented talent. I had an experience where my junior year, I spent a semester away on exchange at Dartmouth College. While I was there, I lived in a fraternity house. Another interesting part of that story. And near the end of my time there, one day, several of the guys in the fraternity in that house came to me and said, hey, you don't have to go back to Fisk. We've talked to the dean. You can get a scholarship to stay in Dartmouth. I'm like, you've done what? They're like, yeah, go see the dean. So I go to the dean. He says, yeah, if you want to stay, there's a scholarship for you. What?
That's
Now, about a year ago, I got an email message from a person who said, hey, Lucius, you might not remember me. You all call me Gus when we were at Dartmouth together. I was one of the people who went to the dean to ask the dean to get you a scholarship to stay in Dartmouth. That email was from Senator Angus King, Maine.
Wow. What
He
a life you've
was-
had.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't even gotten into it yet, but all the people you ended up sort of encountering as you got scholarships to different places, the Moten Center and so on and so forth. But Fisk is important because for people who don't so this is the 60s, everything is changing, talking about consciousness and all this, but you were kind of skeptical. At least when I'm reading your work, it sounds like you were doing really well in school. I think you ended up becoming the president of the student government and stuff, but you were doing really
That's
well.
true. Yeah.
But you weren't fully taking part in all of these things because of your parents, but also it sounded like you were still trying to figure out how you felt about all this kind of incredible change that was happening.
So I come back from Dartmouth after the end of the term at Dartmouth, end of the first semester. So I get back at the start of the second semester at Fisk. So in the student union one day, and the dean of students, a man, is coming in, and I go to him, and of course, knew him well. He knew me for a whole bunch of reasons. But anyway, I said to him, Dean, I need to talk to you. He was with another school official who was head of financial aid. I was on financial, so I knew him well too. So I said, hey, Dean, I need to talk to you. He said, yes, Mr. Outlaw. We're standing in the student union building. And I said, I need to talk to you because I'm thinking of transferring to Dartmouth. The dean immediately turned and walked away from me and walked out of the building. Didn't say a word, just turned immediately and walked away.
Oh.
And the
That's
other
shocking.
official said, Lucius, he's not going to talk to you here. You better go to his office. So I quickly walked out, followed the dean. We go over to his, and, he urges me into his office, and he sit down, he closes his door, and he sit down, and he turns to me. What I remember is something like the following. He looks at me and he says, young man, we have been watching you. We have expectations for you. I'm like, what is he talking about? We've been watching you. We have expectations of you. And he goes on to sort of say, in a sense, there's a way in which I have already been distinguished out by him and other people as, okay, keep our eyes on him. We have expectations for him, etc. And he talks to me about this, something I never knew. I had no idea about any of this, none whatsoever. And he talked to me about that, and then eventually reached in his desk, took out a form, slid it across the desk to me that I could use to withdraw from Fisk. Conversation was over. I took the form and left his office. He went from Fisk.
What happened in your experience? And was it like, because we were talking about the talented 10th, we were talking about, everything that's happening, this moment on the street where you realize you want to do something. Was all that kind of coming together in a different way after that?
I mean, I had spent a semester at Dartmouth and I really liked it, but Dartmouth one thing to my daughter at the time, it was all male. And so I just found it such a off-putting experience I just was not going to play the coercive. And so I just found the whole situation at Dartmouth unappealing. So when I actually flew back to Fisk from Dartmouth with a car full of guys from Dartmouth who were white, and they hung out for a weekend. I said, and when we drove onto the campus, there was a woman walking from one building to another who was a friend. We didn't date, but we were good friends. Stunningly beautiful. Hey, I simply said to the guys, "Hey, guys, you see her? That's why I'm back." But I did think about transferring. But then, after the conversation with the dean, it was like, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not leaving." So that was in the spring, start of the winter semester of 1960. That summer, I spent 7 weeks with some other students from Fisk in a special program in Scandinavia, where we were in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And it was while we were in Denmark, James Meredith was on that walk against fear in Mississippi where he was shot. And when at the end of that march, when other people joined in and they marched to Greenville, Mississippi, where Stokely Carmichael got up and gave the speech, he said, "What we need is more Black power." Well, we were in Denmark. I didn't know what the hell Black power meant. There was one guy in the group from Tuvalu, another HBCU, who the whole 6 weeks we were traveling, we got to be friends. He was reading this one book that I'd never heard of called The Riches of the Earth. And he said, "You got to read this book." But when this whole Black power thing broke in the news, it was international news all over. And we'd wake up in the morning saying, "Okay, who's going to go into the local journals and get a copy of the international New York Times so we can figure out what the hell's going on in the United States?" And this guy was a member of SNCC. So he ended up on Daniel's television explaining what Black power meant and explaining to us what Black power meant. So by the time we were back at Fisk in the fall of 1966, which is my senior year, the Black power thing has broken. And so we're getting people coming to the campus like Stokely Carmichael, Kathleen Cleaver, Spring
Baraka, I
Fisk.
think you came, Mary Baraka, Leroy Jones.
Yeah, there was an annual Spring Arts Festival. And so one of the people at Fisk was John Oliver Killings, a very prominent Black writer who taught writing, but he had to bring in all these people, anybody and everybody who was a Black intellectual writer, the young people, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lerone Bennett, you name them, they were coming to Fisk, and they would have these seminars and stuff, and these exhibitions and whatever, and you were expected to go to them. So for a week or more, this was happening, and I'd go to this talk by Baraka, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, when that was over, I waited and went up to him after and I said, I came to Fisk as a colored man, but I'm going to leave as a Black man. So this is in spring of 1967. So the whole Black power thing is happening. It is impacting. And you may know of a Black poetess, a woman named Nikki Giovanni.
Yep.
Nikki Giovanni was a classmate. Now, Nikki and a bunch of students were petitioning to have a chapter of SNCC on campus. The administration didn't want a SNCC chapter. I'm president of student government. The student handbook says any new student organization has to be chartered by student. The problem was nobody knew what it meant to charter a new student organization because it hadn't happened during our time in Fisk, and there were no guidelines. So then the president said, "Well, we'll give you guidelines." So he and some board members wrote up guidelines and called me to a meeting and said, "Here are your guidelines." And the first was, the organization must have a stable national leadership. Well, Stokely Carmichael was president of SNCC. They weren't going to regard Stokely as a stable. I'm like, "Oh, no, I'm not going to do this," because I had gotten elected. When I was running for president, I was classed as the radical because I had called for a student strike. And what was the issues of the strike? Longer hours in the library, better food in the dining center, and longer weekend hours for the girls. And I had come from Dartmouth where what the radical thing for me was student power. Because this was part of what was happening with the anti-war movement, the Black power movement. It was all centered around student power. So that was my issue was, I'm government president. I got elected calling for student power, right? So when this issue about the SNCC chapter came up, the SNCC people were politically miles ahead of me. I was committed to student power. They were actually for other kinds of power. And so we were having this intense battle. So they're pressing me for some things. The administration is pressing containing in another way. So student government is in the middle. So I'm in the middle between these two pressure points, right? So one night we're having this meeting and the people from SNCC come in and beat us to death. They call us lackeys of the white trustees, just all kinds of derogatory stuff. And I'm just worn out. I'm trying to get them to chill because I know the administration is trying to set them up so they couldn't have a chaplain. I'm trying to say, look, you got to give us some space to figure this out because they're trying to set you guys up, but I'm not going to go with that. But you got to give us a break till we figure out how that we can do this real well. So one night after a long, heated meeting, we leave. I walk out of the meeting room. I'm standing in the hallway. Nikki Giovanni, who's been in there calling us everything but a child of God, walks up to me, kisses me on the cheek, and says, "Leave you, it's okay," and walks away. That was just like, what the hell just happened? Right? Because I thought it was all personal. And all she was saying was, it's not personal. It's political. We love you. And I saw her years later, and actually I got to introduce her at Fisk about a year or two ago. She was back to give a Jubilee Day address, and they asked me to introduce her. And I began by saying, it was the strangest kiss I ever had. It was like, wait, it's important. So now you can have an understanding of what the dissertation was about.
Well, actually, before we get to that, because you mentioned friends, Fanon already, and you mentioned language. Those are two important things. And this change, like you yourself are thinking you're going to become Black in this way of language. But we haven't talked really about the problematic that you use there is Du Bois, who we have talked about, but this idea of double consciousness. So were you reading Du Bois at this time?
I read The Souls of Black Folk while at Fisk. Du Bois is a major figure at Fisk. So I had a copy of The Souls of Black Folk, and I had read it. And I don't remember being particularly moved by it in any particular sense at the time. But by the time I get to graduate school, so I'm in Boston from 67 to 70. So, well, Boston is is a major academic center in the United States. When I was in graduate school, there was something calculated to be like 250,000 students in a 25-mile radius of Boston, downtown Boston. So there were lots of political things happening. And of course, my first year, I'm there in the fall of 67. In the spring of 68, I'm in a seminar with all graduate students and professors talking about how we do teaching and other kinds of stuff as graduate fellows. There's a break in the seminar. There was a white woman who was a year or two ahead of me, comes rushing in and said, "Hey, Lou, did you hear?" I said, "Did I hear what?" "About Dr. King." "Now, what about Dr. King?" She said, "He was killed." Well, I was the only Black person in the graduate program. Right? And when she said that to me, the only reaction I had was, I've got to get out of here. So I just got up and walked out. I didn't say anything to anybody. I just left. I made my way back down to really Central Park, lived across the street from the Prudential Center. And I was just lost. I left. I go back to where my apartment was down near the Prudential building. I just go walking along the streets. People are crying. They're driving, the sirens. And I can't figure out what to make of all this. They killed Martin Luther King Jr. And so this is a pretty turbulent period. So my roommate in the apartment was actually one of my roommates and best friends from Fisk. He was at Harvard Law School studying. And this was the friend who the conversation with us. "Oh, boy, you don't really have to do this religious preaching thing if you don't want." He was really influential and stuff. So anyway, he had a back bedroom with a window that overlooked the Prudential building, which at the time was the tallest building in Boston. I was in the front bed. So I'm in there reading for a seminar on Sartre's Being and Nothingness. And my roommate starts saying, "Oh, roommate, come on, right quick. So I go running back to this bedroom, and he points out the Prudential building. He says, "Let's go burn down the Prue." I said, "Roommate, you can't burn down the Prudential. It's made of concrete and steel." He says, "That's not the point. Let's go burn down the Prue." And I'm like, what the hell is wrong with this guy? He is a Black guy from, Hot Springs, Arkansas, studying law at Harvard Law School. Let's go burn down the Prudential. I'm here thinking, how do I explain to my parents that I'm in Boston getting a PhD, but I've been arrested because I had a can of gasoline and matches heading over to a concrete steel building because I'm going to burn the damn thing down, which can't burn. This makes no sense. He kept saying, you don't understand. You don't understand. Let's go burn down the crew. And I'm like, no, roommate, I don't know. What the hell is wrong with you? And he finally said, well, he's at Harvard. He's at Harvard Law. He's got this Fisk background. He's studying law, and they're making clear to him at Harvard, we're not interested in questions of social justice, period. We're not interested. Your job is to learn to think like a lawyer, brief the case, tell us what the law says, etc. If you don't like that, you can go somewhere else. He's really frustrated. So he's like, we need to go do something. Let's go down. Yeah, I understand your frustration. But trying to burn down the Prudential building, which can't burn, ain't a way to do it. I'm not doing that. He's like, you just open up. And so I had to go figure out, well, what am I going to do? I ended up joining an interracial organization, working on stuff. I became editor of their newsletter. And, I had to find outlets for what I was doing. And then it was like, okay, what am I going to do in a dissertation? And I chose this problematic that had to do with the call for Black power. And I had been reading Fanon, that chapter on the Negro and language, and I sort of hit upon this problematic. What is the call for Black consciousness all about? And for me, it became perhaps here is a means by which to resolve this double consciousness. That shift of language from Negro to Black, the embracing of what had been a derogatory term as a positive, and talking about Black consciousness and self-consciousness. In order to do that, you'd have to resolve what had been a negative duality, this separation between oneself and being Black. You have to get past that. So the dissertation project became my way of contending with all of that intellectually and setting myself a trajectory. And when I posed it to the chair of the department, he just sort of looked at it and said, you're going to be on your own. It was the way which they were accommodating me in an interesting way. It was like, basically, let's not mess with you. It was like, okay, you're going to be on your own. And that was, I found a professor who said, yeah, I'll supervise your dissertation. He had no reading in any of it. I had discovered now for just walking in a bookstore, I saw a title called Phenomenology of the Social World. I was like, whoa, what the hell is this? And I bought it. One thing you were allowed to do in the graduate program was design reading courses on your own. So I designed my own reading course around Schutz, and I started reading Schutz. Even when I had left and went to Nashville to teach at Fisk, I would order my books from this bookstore called Mandrake, because they had all these titles from all around the world, in particular, all this stuff from Phenomenology and Existentialism. The whole Northwestern University had the whole series in Phenomenology and Existentialism. Kay had a series of it. So I happened to see these books, and so I started buying these books by Schutz, and I just designed a reading program, and this professor agreed to advise, who became my dissertation advisor, but he knew nothing about any of it. He was learning with me, and he later on started teaching Schutz and all this stuff. I started reading Schutz, and then, for example, one of the other resources that came along was George Herbert Mead. And so the whole notion of how you socialize children and et cetera, to try to figure out how to bring together into a coherent project, and became the dissertation.
Well, you mentioned German before, that you had some German classes. And I think I remember reading somewhere that you had a really good teacher in Hegel and Kant. And I remember also that you got turned on to Marcuse and the Frankfurt School at some point, because I think someone dragged you to a lecture and you didn't even know what you were going to, and it was Marcuse. Maybe that was at Boston College too.
Yeah, that was at BC. The first day I got to Boston College, another graduate student, coat, tie, had the pipe, the whole persona stuff. I was introducing him. He took me over to the Eagleton, which is a cafeteria stuff, to meet some other graduate students who were actually in my cohort. So there were these two other white guys. Now, one of the white guys had graduated from Vanderbilt University in Nashville. I didn't know him. He was from Little Rock, Arkansas, white. He was dating a Black woman at Fisk, whom I knew. I had actually tried to date her, and she said, I'm already seeing somebody else. And then she later said, you're going to Boston College. My boyfriend is going. Make sure you meet him. I was like, okay. but I get that at first day. That was him. Then there was another white guy who had long hair and a beard. At Boston College at the time was male-only school. Women were in the School of Nursing or the School of Education, but not in the College of Arts and Science. And all the young men in the College of Arts had to wear coats and ties to school. I walk up to this camper in the summer. I've been on a button-down short sleeve shirt. I've got a camera because I'm in the photography. When I see all these young white boys running around in coats and ties, I'm like, what the hell is this? How can I be? I've known the wrong campers because this is nothing like I had imagined be. So to get to the snap I meet these two white guys, and the one with the long hair, he's from going to school in California. He was from Oregon. He's dating a woman whose family is from South America. And he's looking at me, stroking his beard, and he's like, this is such a weird damn place. And I'm like, yeah, we are good friends to this day. That's why the three of us, all of us got married within a year or so. We became a very, very tight group of people, etc.
A good first meeting then. Lucky you.
A guy from Oregon had gone to school in California near San Francisco. Said to me one day, hey, I'm going to hear this lecture down at BC. You should come go. So I go to this room, it's standing room only, and this all guy comes up to the podium and start giving this lecture, and it was riveting. And I'm like, who the hell is this? And he's like, it's Herbert Marcuse, right? I'm in a seminar on Hegel with Jacques Dominio from Reverend, and what he did, we had the Bailey translation of the Phenomenology, and he would have us, one of us read a paragraph or so, and then he would explicate it. He had a German edition, he had a French edition, and he would explicate paragraph by paragraph by paragraph by paragraph. That was the seminar.
Yeah. So you learn that kind of movement. That I bring it up for a reason, because I feel like in your dissertation and double consciousness, the way you bring phenon, and I'm interested in this, your understanding of this dialectical pattern or whatever too, and how that might have been important in your thinking, because also with the Frankfurt School, because Marcuse was your intro into that, but you ended up, we can talk about it later another time, but that Frankfurt School group, even meeting Habermas, and there's a lot of this pattern of this dialectical kind of reconciliation, I guess, is what I'm wondering about. You kind of started learning that maybe in that Hegel class, or?
Oh, no, the Hegel class was very, very influential. I mean, I tell people, if you read Hegel, you may not agree with Hegel, but you would not be able to think in the way you did before you read Hegel. That if you really begin to understand, I used to say to students, reading Marcuse or reading Hegel, it's like learning to dance or to make love with a partner for the first time. It's really kind of awkward at first because your bodies are not coordinated. I mean, it's like when you kiss somebody for the first time, it's awkward. You don't know who's going to spin the head which way, you bump noses. But after you dance with somebody with a partner for a long time, you begin to know body moves, their rhythm, how they coordinate their rhythms with your rhythms, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, to me, learning to understand someone like a Hegel is like learning to dance with a partner. You got to learn the rhythm of his thinking. How does he structure his sentences? How does he organize a paragraph? What's the rhythm of the logic in what he's saying? And once you get it, to me, it's really easy reading. I mean, once you understand the rhythm of the logic and how it flows.
I mean, I've always thought the same about Hegel, that you're almost learning more of a new kind of movement or calibration, or you talk a lot about praxis and practice and action and thought. And there is something about, if you can read Hegel from a certain way, you learn a new thought movement. It's not necessarily about what he says. I totally don't agree with all this junk he talks about in terms of history, but it's more the movement that you learn this movement, right? Which I'd also sense in other writers, not just Hegel, but and I think it's in your dissertation too. You're doing something of that movement. But yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I think that's a really important distinction that I don't really ever hear made.
Yeah, I mean, and I try to tell students, every writer has a rhythm. So it's about learning, that's why I always say to students, your first responsibility is always to give the writer his or her say, not to judge them, but to hear them. You've got to let them lead the dance. And you've got to learn how to get in step, get in sync with the rhythm of their moves. If not, then I mean, you're violating a fundamental ethical principle of hermeneutic, justice, and patience and generosity. Give the writer his or her say. Learn to dance with them. Learn how to get his step. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing. Is you've got to give them their say. Open yourself up to them. Now, if they can persuade you to dance, now you could end up dancing saying, but I don't want to marry you. I enjoy dancing with you. I go to sleep with you every night. One time, maybe you're not, but not that ain't, don't, I don't need to do this again. Appreciate you for the person that you are. And once I began to get that rhythm, and I had this conversation with Dominio when I was taking the Hegel seminar, because, I'm trying to understand the U.S. How can Hegel help me understand the U.S.? Originally I had gone to be thinking I was going to focus on analytics law. So we got all this anti-war, like how all this stuff going on. I'm sitting around analyzing sentences. I'm like, no, this makes no sense. I need another studies. So I'm reading Hegel and trying to understand, how can it help me understand my situation, the U.S., et cetera, the life I've had. I'm trying to contend with this race stuff. And so I have a one-on-one with Dominio, and we started talking. He says, yes, the United States has a lot of negativity, but there's no real appreciation for negation. And it helped me to appreciate Hegel in a particularly kind of way. Then when I started reading Marcuse, in particular, if you read in one of his texts, there's an introduction to one of the texts called A Note on Dialectic. It's a really interesting way of accounting for dialectical thinking and logic within the context of Hegel. And he has this whole thing about that if you read Hegel, he argues it is shot through with historic grounding and implications. It's not just speculative, abstract stuff. So that was helpful. All of those are sort of resources that I'm trying to draw upon and put to work in a particular way. One of the other really significant happenings while I was in graduate school is this person comes to campus to speak, being given by a man named Harold Cruz. Harold Cruz had published this book called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. Now, there were two kind of seminal moments for me in graduate school. One, I went to a bookstore in Cambridge one night, browsing, and I see on the stand a journal called The Black Scholar. And I was just stunned by those two words being together in a way I had never seen before. Scholar and black. And put those two things together. Now, remember, I'm still working through this whole black consciousness thing. Cruz gives this talk based on his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. I read the book, and there's a deep critique going on about Negro intellectuals. Well, already in the Black Power movement, there's a distinction between being Negro and being Black. One is negative and one is positive. So I'm reading through this and saying, by Cruz, there's a whole tradition of Negro people being intellectually applied in certain kinds of ways, and why that is problematic, and you need to be thinking a different kind of way. Oh, wow, there's a whole new agenda. There's this new journal called The Black Scholar. Well, and in fact, one of the founders of that journal, I just got to notice, died a couple of days ago, Nathan Hare. So he's the head of the first Black Studies program in California. So all of these influences are happening at this fertile time in my life. And now I've got a whole new notion of what it might mean to be an intellectual. I couldn't get with the notion of a scholar. I was planning to be a college teacher. I wasn't thinking about scholarship. But I see a possibility in this notion of being an intellectual, which fits with me, because I like the intellectual stuff. What might mean to be an intellectual who is Black, committed to social justice, and happen to make conditions better for Black folk and Black folk in the United States, and have an international perspective that says anti-war stuff and Vietnam and Afghanistan, all this thing. How might I bring all this together? And so the dissertation became that kind of project of, I think there's a way I can bring this all together. So
Yeah, it was like you call it kind of a hermeneutics of the transformation of consciousness, or at least that's how I'm thinking of it. Then that's why it came to me. So I think we have to pause for just a second though, because this will be probably a little bit wrong, and you can correct me. But here's kind of how I'm thinking of all this to try to thread these things together. I know like a lot of listeners will know some of this and not other parts, like Hegel maybe, or not this, or so. Okay, we were talking about your consciousness situated, nested in time period, and there were many kinds of ways we could have thought about your consciousness, but in a way, we've been talking about a transformation of consciousness in a sense, and then we were also talking about the philosophical part of that. So there's this, and we talked about this feeling of this kind of dialectic of things doubling, like double consciousness in Du Bois, or when we think of Marcuse and Hegel, this dialectical movement that two seeming opposites are kind of recognizing one another, and in so doing opening a different path, so that it wasn't really opposites, but there's some kind of movement there or patterning that's a doubling in a similar way to Du Bois in terms of setting something against itself, or having to, in maybe the way you did as a child, looking across the street and there's a white church and there's a black church and it doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's a kind of doubling there, or the way Du Bois talks about it of the black experience, where you have no choice but to realize that, where the white people don't have to really realize that. But so there's all these themes, right, that I see as connected. And I guess what I'm trying to get at now is you were just talking about Negro and black, and that too has a history, right? There's a time when those words are in this dynamical process of changing, and you're kind of noticing that changing, and it's tied to the transformation, and this becomes part of your dissertation. But I think for people who don't, because, you could start at different points in history and those words are going to mean different things. And they're going to be, for the people using them, meaning different things. But as you show in your dissertation, this is part of this reconciliation process that's going on, and maybe even part of how we're going to continue resolving a lot of things that bother us. But before we can really look at that, can you help people understand these two words? Like, they weren't necessarily always opposites, right? Or were they? Or what was going on there? I'm a little worried people won't really understand, or maybe that I don't even really understand how that was when you saw black scholar. Yeah, I don't know. Like, what was that movement?
Think about it this way. So as a kid growing up, right, if you really wanted to assault another kid verbally, one of the ways was to call them black, because all the connotations were really very negative. Dirty, stinky, inferior, you name. Right. And remember, when we're reading Du Bois, it's the souls of black folk in Starving, Mississippi. So black was always a negative connotation. So part of the work of a lot of the young folk on SNCC and in what became the Black consciousness movement, drawing off of their readings of Fanon, the Negro and language, et cetera, was, as one scholar later, Kelly Joy, was to reverse the symbolic weightings of key terms. Take a negative and turn it into a positive. So think of how we now might orient ourselves to the term queer. It used to be an act, but people took it, reinvested it with meaning, and gave it a new positive significance rather than an invidious significance. And so that's what began to happen with what was called the Black conscious music. Take the term black, and instead of taking it as a weapon or thinking of it as a negative, rather, I'm black and I'm proud. That shift in the language of self-reference was psychologically very wrenching. It took a lot of time, effort, and work to go from a negative to a positive with these key terms. And that's why I was focusing on it by saying there's an awful lot happening in going from Negro to black. It will give us an entree into some larger cultural, political happenings in the life of black people. And so much is about language, and I'm in some ways working on that still now, but I'm dealing with Ralph Ellison and reading Kenneth Burke and language and similar, a whole bunch of other stuff going on right now. But that was the insight, that was the enterprise that I was committing myself to. But it also led me further into Frankfurt School and down to critical social theory, and at some point sort of pretty much exhausting my time with that, well, decided, okay, Habermas, I've had enough. Let me go somewhere else.
This is really, really important, I think, and I want to try to talk about it a little bit because, like you were saying, this is a whole lot of work. All this, we're only talking a couple hours here, but all this change of the stance or being able to turn the positive into a negative, I mean, it's a kind of internal, it requires something like the person, many people, like nested, the individuals, but also these groups, becoming aware, first of all, of the situation in terms of, I guess, what we would say Du Bois is talking about with the double consciousness. So you're already aware of it. If you're the person who's being, I guess, if you're in a particular context, then you have to be aware that you're being seen in a certain way. But then you kind of become aware, as you did, in a way that this doesn't make sense. And then you begin to, it's almost like an Aikido or a Tai Chi or some kind of, in the same way we were talking about with the Hegelian movement, you're noticing that energy, becoming present to it, and then you're taking it as your own in a sense, or like owning it. And in so doing, changing this whole dynamic between whoever it was using that term in a negative way. So this long process of what we were talking about with consciousness, right? I think there's like consciousness raising is this kind of phrase that you use sometimes, or transforming consciousness. In a way, do you see this kind of praxis of becoming aware of something that's happening and, I guess, owning that and then redefining that, and not always consciously, but sometimes consciously? Is that part of all of this?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing we got to talk about going to Hamilton. So I went to Hamilton in 1980 to visit for a year. I moved away 21 years later. Now, accepting an invitation to go to Hamilton for a year was a very, very, very wrenching experience. A very difficult experience because I had been committed to working in HBCUs. I wanted to be in historical backgrounds. I wanted to be in the South, et cetera, et cetera. So now, for a whole bunch of reasons, I'd leave Fisk, I'd go to Morgan State, another historical black college. It wasn't working well for me as a state institution. So I get invited to go into this predominantly white institution. Well, I've been interviewed at other predominantly white institutions and didn't.
I think you'd even been offered you could stay at Boston College and you'd said no because you wanted.
Right.
It goes back to that
I
moment
wanted
on
to-
the street of that was the part you were going to play at that time.
And so now I've got this opportunity to go to her, and I'm really torn. So I go talk to one of my friends at Morgan State, who's still a close friend to this day, and I start telling him how agonized I'm about this responsibility. I'm turning my back on my people. He looks at me and he says, "No, you're not." He says, "We know who you are. You're going to be fine. Go to Hamilton. We know who you are. You're going to be fine. It's okay." Well, I was like, God, he just sort of took this rock of guilt.
What a
off my shoulder.
gift. Yeah.
I go to Hamilton, and then I come to another realization. Okay, if some of us who are involved in African American and Black studies, we've been critical of the way the literature has been canonized and the histories have been written, how racism is played in the writing of histories, the building of disciplines, and all of this, I come to this realization, well, so I'm at Hamilton, come to this realization. If all of our critiques of the way in which canons, histories have been constructed under the auspices of white racial supremacy and all of that, if I want correctives to that, part of that corrective has got to mean that successive generations of white children are going to have to be taught in ways different from the way in which they've been taught. So initially I was guilt-ridden about going, and that was when I came to the realization, well, wait a minute. White young people in college need me as much as some Black students need me. Because if we're going to disrupt the cross-generational perpetuation of white supremacy, one of the ways we are going to do it is by educating new generations of young white people. So there's important work for me to do here. And so I spent the next 40 years working in predominantly white institutions. And one of the essays I wrote for a particular volume, the title of it is The Rehabilitating Whiteness ? So, there's been a prominent sort of movement at one point called the abolition of whiteness, led by a Black lady economist, a white believe because of the United States, crudeism, again, the way we saw the racial problem is getting rid of the notion of whiteness, the abolition of whiteness. Now, I find that a deeply problematic notion for all kinds of reasons. But simply put, if white folk could take the notion of blackness and rehabilitate it from a negative to a positive, why would I conclude that the same thing can't be done with the notion of whiteness? There's nothing inherent in the notion of whiteness that requires white supremacy or invidious notions of either whiteness or blackness. It's a term. We invest the term, we give the term some meaning. So what would we have whiteness mean? That's really up to us. And so when I reflect upon how black folk rework the meaning of blackness, I say white folk can rework the meaning of whiteness, have it come to mean something completely different from white supremacy and all of that. There's nothing inherent in the notion of whiteness. So I invite whiteness, well, tell me how to do it. No. That's not my job. It's not my job to tell you what whiteness should mean for you. That's your work. I didn't have you tell me what whiteness had to mean for me. I had to work that out. Inviting you, I will support you taking up the really hard work against the grain of centuries of wanting out a new notion of whiteness that has nothing to do with white supremacy and racism. Nothing. Now, I don't find that strange or odd since I've known white folk who were not committed to notions of white supremacy or racism. So that's nothing mysterious about it to me. There have always been white folk who thought of themselves different.
Well,
But
it
there's
comes to
work
me
to be
from
done.
in your thesis, you talk about in the dissertation or in other writings, you discuss this, that we need to understand this, the double consciousness is like this transformation of consciousness, this self-consciousness of Black folks, I think you say, and this consciousness raising and all of this. It starts, you basically, I feel like we all need to understand that, white or Black or whoever, right? And that maybe is part of what you're saying now about, like, I wonder if this pattern that you describe, because in the dissertation, it's pretty much a way to reconfigure these praxis of social cultural meaning and praxis, right? The
Mhm.
life world. We don't have a lot of time to
Mhm.
talk about the phenomenology, but it's really, you're really talking about lived experience, a transformation of lived experience, which is coming about through symbols. So you can't really ever symbolize fully this world, but with language, we kind of have this third space where we can externally represent and discuss all of this process. And through reconfigurations there, like the one that you describe with the actual language, what happens there, it's a shift of power and of meaning. It's a reconfiguring meaning, and it's reconfiguring practice, and it's reconfiguring it for all parts because it's the process. And I feel like that can be nested right into what you're saying with other groups of people and people who haven't had to engage in it in the way that Black folks have, in the way that Du Bois was writing about with the double consciousness. That's a specific experience of Black people in America, but I feel like the pattern of it is what you're describing in the dissertation a bit, and also what other groups could do. And, you know, of course, as group, it's always we're representing something that's an ongoing process and has many different ways of being looked at. But I guess what I feel like I'm trying to get at is that we all can learn from this double consciousness in a way that could help reconfigure meanings and practices of our shared life world in ways that I think you're getting at in terms of what whiteness needs to be concerned with. Does that make sense at all?
Sure. So part of what I'm having to prepare for now, a couple of weeks ago, a person who came, a very historic figure, that I had the good fortune of coming to know, becoming good friends with my wife and becoming a major influence in my life. A man named the Reverend James Morris Lawson Jr. Does that name ring a bell?
Describe from your perspective.
He died a couple of weeks ago. So he was the person who taught direct action, civil disobedience to John Lewis and Diane Nash and a whole bunch of other young people in Nashville in the late 50s. So he'd been at Vanderbilt, he got expelled. Anyway, I was involved in bringing him back to Nashville as a distinguished professor, visiting professor for several years when I was an associate professor. So we can be good friends. Well, he died a couple of weeks ago, but he had specified in instructions for his field service that I was to give for marks in his field service.
Oh, wow.
So I will be doing that in LA on July 6th. But one of the things that I am trying to figure out how to work into this is a conception that I've come to. I had a conversation once. I called him and said, I'm trying to figure out what it means to try to be involved in the situation in the Middle East, involved Israelis and Palestinians, right? How might a movement of the kind you were so significant in Nashville, in the country, and in Memphis and LA and other places, how might that take place? So we talked a bit about it. So one of the things I came upon, and I shared with a couple of former students when I was at Harvard, there was a period where I had 3 advisees in the same class who were philosophy majors, and they were at the time good friends. One was an African American woman, one was a Jewish woman, one was a Palestinian. Good friends, and I'm their advisor. So they were very special. And I always said to them, you are my vision for the possibilities of the future. Right? So recently I was talking to the Palestinian woman and the African American woman. There's been some tensions in the relationships involved. I had been thinking about this, and I said to the Palestinian woman that as for my generation, part of the battle took place, if you will, on the terrain of language. The transformation of Black from a negative to a positive. So for me, there's part of the battle for the future of a just situation in the Middle East. It's also going to have to be on the terrain of battle. And what I'm getting at is over an expression of a vision for what can happen in that region. So that feminists, so that queer, lesbian, bisexual, trans, gay, etc. people have to invest all of that with new positive meanings. So now we have Pride Week. We speak of queer studies in university when it used to be in Africa. And the battle on the terrain of language, that is a way of being able to envision and give expression to new visions by which we can order our lives and move forward together. It's part of what I think has to be done in that region of the world. And to me, part of what I will be offering in that area, the Reverend was one of the greatest gifts ever to the history of this country. Because here's a person, I said, if you look at the United States after 9/11, they declare war. If you look at what happens in Israel after October, they declare war. And in both cases, the nations felt themselves justified. If you look at what happened to African people and their descendants, millions of people were enslaved, millions died, millions were oppressed, etc. However, it has never been the case that Black people have taken that as a justification for declaring war on white people. Now, I find that utterly amazing. Instead, you have a movement grounded in love. That to me is utterly astounding. And I think that's a tremendous gift of the United States.
I've read where you talk about, there are no like real categories, but we need to make categories. So in the same way that there's this map territory thing in a way. So you have this ongoing life world process where there's actually no distinctions. Everything is alive and changing all the time and changing each other. But when it comes like language already, we are making distinctions, and language is the place where you're going to change that process in a sense, even though the language itself is never fully representing that process. It's representing it, but it's not the territory. It's a map of the territory. But I hear you saying, actually, the way we change the maps changes the territory. So it matters how we change the map. It matters how we change the language. And what you're just saying is powerful too, but I think also it matters from what perspective the agency is being given. Like, depending on where you're using those words or where you're listening to what you just said about them, they're going to be interpreted in a different way because the map isn't the territory, right? So your meaning behind that, the way you actually mean it, might be being interpreted a completely different way if someone's kind of using a different map, so to speak, And same with that happened, I think, a lot with the struggles we've been talking about, and you know better than me, where your dad knew how to kind of use the language to get what he wanted in a sense, because he had to learn that. That's a different perspective than the white person who didn't get any of that, So I guess what I'm trying to say is doesn't it get really complicated in terms of that there's so many different ways of using the same symbols such that sometimes we think we're talking about the same thing or expressing the same thing and we're not, or that someone might hear what you just said and hear it from actually through a completely different map than the one you mean it by. Isn't that a complication too? And yeah, how does that get worked out?
By making a commitment to working it out rather than shooting it out. In the following simple kind of way. I hear what you're saying. What do you mean? Here's what I thought you meant, is that what you play it back, and I say, no, that is what I said, is not what I meant or intended. So let's talk this through. We call it dialogue. Right? Now, a dialogue, in order to be effective and have the potential for succession, is going to be ethically structured. There's got to be some norms that structure dialogue, like fundamental respect for the participants in the dialogue, listening, asking questions prior to rendering final judgments, being open to the possibility of changing oneself. Well, you said something, yeah, but I thought you meant, no, that's not what I mean. Oh, but I understand you thought, but here's what, oh, I misspoke. Oh, I misheard. Okay, well, let's try it again, right? That process is crucial to having a stable, viable community. Well, what do we mean? In some sense, we call it democracy. But there's a whole bunch of philosophical anthropology, politics, ethics, etc., that has to undergird democratic praxis. Has to. You want to have it. And one has to be committed to, one has to give up on a certain kind of epistemological commitments. Namely, truth is going to come by way of a method I have worked out that guarantees me successful acquisition of truth. And I've got the right methods of doing it. No. What is going to be truthful and best for all of us is what's going to come out of ideological engagement with what the issues are, what the desires and wishes are, that we work out between and amongst ourselves in a way that serves all of us as well as we can, given what we're working with. And then we have to continue to work at that. Continue to work at that. And each of us has to be prepared. Now, the other thing is, there's another whole discussion we have in there. So much of what I've been given over to over the last couple of decades, growing out of focusing up on the notion of race, and this has to do very much with Du Bois, is to work out, for my own understanding, what was Du Bois's sense of human evolution. I am convinced he was an evolutionist, that his notion about raciality, racial groupings, was not an essentialist notion, that he was an evolutionist. If I stand back and look at our human species, there's no way I know how to make sense of the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens without having an account of groupings.
It reminds me of the way you talk about symbols and language in the dissertation. You know, this theme kind of continues on where there's a distinction to be made between the language and the symbol area, the map, I would call it, and the territory, which is the process, the ongoing, dynamic, ever-changing, all of it, right? Where, of course, there's no categories. There's no real such thing as a species because it's all always changing and moving. There's no, all these terms we use, of course, in that life world or process, it's all dynamic and always changing. However, to be alive, to communicate, to have anything like a language or symbols or science or philosophy, we do use categories. We do need categories.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I'm drawn to now is that I'm convinced about is that our species is first and foremost a social species. No group has all of the knowledge resource to solve all of the problems that come up in this world. One of the things you need is new information. How do you solve certain kinds of problems? If you survey the world and see how people who live differently have come up with similar problems and figured out how to resolve the problems, you enhance the well-being of all. Take away that diversity, take away that adaptability, all you need is a new problem for which we don't have a ready answer, and the game is going to be over. You eliminate the adaptiveness, game over. So the openness and learning, the being able to encounter the new and the different, to run the assessment without having to say, you're not like me, therefore I've got to condemn you, rather than saying, oh, what's that new dish you created? Can I taste it? Oh, wow, what's in this? What are its properties? How might this be helpful, etc.? Those are the keys to the viability of our species. That's the insight that I think that Du Bois grasped really, really well.
Yeah, well said. And do you think that that double consciousness is part of it? Is that an old term, or can we keep using that doubling to better understand this process?
What he described as double consciousness was a problematic state. So he wasn't recommending doubling. It was a particular kind of situation. What he was opting for was a resolution of what had become a troubling split.
I feel like that's what I was trying to get at with this this dialectic, or this pattern, that the reality isn't that troubling split, but somehow through this recognition that we've seen it wrongly, or that we've seen it differently, then another path opens up. It doesn't mean we need that, but maybe there's other ways in which we can get to a place of transformation by noticing that we've doubled, I guess, or that we're seeing that we have this double consciousness of that others have it. Even maybe that it's because I feel like this theme applies to a lot of either or situations that end up becoming incredibly destructive and painful for different groups. It's not the same as the Black American experience and the way that Du Bois describes it, but you brought up like the queer experience, for example, and I think there's a double consciousness there, or
Sure.
the other, so maybe there's a way in which this pattern we can notice is happening in a lot of different places in different ways, not to like say that it's all like exactly the same way, but I guess that's more what I mean.
Right. Well, so part of what I'm trying to learn to appreciate, and I've been writing and teaching to appreciate, is how do we contend with that which differs? And part of what I'm trying to work through is an appreciation for, if you will, the evolutionary throwing up of difference and diversity, and how, in some ways, that is an adaptive, a key to adaptive success if taken up, understood and taken up in appropriate kinds of ways.
Exactly. Just as you show in your dissertation, in that sense of it looks like a negative, but if you take it in a different way and make it a positive, that it's almost like right now we think difference strikes us as something bad, or that we need to be afraid of, or that we need to resolve, when instead it's like a portal into a transformation, to put it in kind of terms, a transformation of consciousness that ends up affecting both sides. It's a different way of thinking about all of that I feel like the world really needs right now.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is to let go of the fears that motivate us to try to mobilize resources to eliminate differences and establish what we take to be the safety of homogeneity. And I'm saying there are dangers in homogeneity. That homogeneity needs to be tempered by new information that is heterogeneous. That homogeneity can easily lead to stasis and render us individual or a group of people or some living being, render them maladaptive. Because the homogeneity is built upon a certain amount of information. But that information can easily become maladaptive in a dynamic world. Our universe is not a frozen stasis. It's dynamic.
There is no
So-
homogeneity. If there was, we wouldn't be here in another way
Right.
to say it.
So how do we continue, but how we take up differences for growth and transformation?
Right. Maybe noticing the patterns and appreciating the patterns without thinking they have to be corresponding to some specific substance in some specific thing. I mean, that's that map territory thing. But also, I have to bring up this word love here because this is Love and Philosophy, and we're talking about all of this. And I don't know about like love and Du Bois, but I feel like what we're trying to describe right now is a kind of it does put you into a place of love. I mean, you've been with your wife, you said 50 years, I think, and you were talking about
54 on the way to 55.
Okay, so you must know something about seeing things from a different position, or I don't know. Okay, if I bring up that word love, what is that? How do you see that in this process that we're talking about?
I mean, think about it. So this was a central concern for Martin Luther King Jr., the movement for Reverend Lawson, etc. And King said, look, I'm not talking about erotic love, I'm talking about agape love. So part of it is getting worked out, what do we mean by love? And part of it in that movement was there was a care for the rescue of white people from their racism, as well as for the rescue of Negro people from the racism of white people. That both things needed to happen.
Mm.
That you needed to be as caring for the well-being of white people beyond racism as you could for Black people in rescuing them from racism. That everybody needed to be loved. That love was going to be key to helping everybody, caring for the very overall. Right? And that means for me, it means I have to reject a position articulated by Malcolm X, who said, by any means necessary. My position is, there are some means I will not accept.
Like your dad on the sidewalk.
That's
Mhm.
right.
Yeah.
That is, if I say by any means necessary, well, I'm not going to accept it. I don't think I am justified in using any means to achieve my end. That I need not have any regard for those against whom I struggle. I don't accept it.
It doesn't
I
seem
don't
like
think-
love.
I-
It doesn't seem like we can fit love onto that.
No, there's no way to fit love into there. I mean, I find the very notion of advocating by any means necessary morally reprehensible. I think one of the most reprehensible ethical things that Malcolm X ever said. I think it's morally reprehensible to advocate by any means necessary. Any means? We've got plenty of evidence in human history of atrocities. But if you're going to endorse that, there's no distinction about atrocities versus humane struggle, where you're committed to preserving humanity of people against whom you struggle.
I think it has to do
I'm
with
not committed to.
when we feel
So,
like we only have one
Yeah.
choice or the other. It's that thing too, where there's never that.
And
what you
again,
do.
I just found it absolutely astounding that I have come upon no history of a principled commitment on the part of Black folk to wage war on white people. And I just found utterly astounding.
So
But
what about like Marcus Garvey and this kind of
Garvey
Oh, no.
wants separation. Garvey wants separation. Garvey goes to Klan meetings. Garvey has Klan people coming to him. He says, because we agree on the same thing. We need to be separated from each other. They think they're telling me, yeah, we don't need to be together. We can't live together. Let's just go to separate places and live. Y'all be y'all, we'll be us. Right? So he wasn't calling for war on white people. Again, that's the thing. Here's another example for me. Think of an enslaved black woman working on a plantation where she's preparing food for the slave-owning family and feeding them. Now, one of her options might be, I could end this by poisoning the whole white family. She doesn't. She could say, this is a cross-generational project. They will the slaves to other people. They've got a baby. Instead, she nurtures the baby, sometimes lets the baby suckle from her own nipples to sustain the baby. Why? I mean, I just find that utterly mind-blowing.
Yeah. I think it's love. I think
It's
it's some
That's
connection with
right.
the reality.
My maternal grandmother said to me on more than one occasion, son, the only way you can keep somebody in the ditch is that you got to get in the ditch with them. Don't get in the ditch with the white man. Right? They would laugh at certain things about white folk. They never propose hatred of white people. Never.
hmm
I mean, I just find that spirit that runs across the entire history of African peoples in the Western world, to me, it's just mind. I think it's such an extraordinarily powerful lesson and gift.
It makes me think of Eric Fromm a little bit in Love, who I know you talked to and knew, actually. We didn't even get into that story, but that's a kind of love that a lot of us, that much of the world is still trying to learn. And I think in those stories that you just told shows that it's actually here, and it's been here even in the most painful of times. People have had that, so it's real, right?
Really, I'm saying, to me, that is why a person like Reverend Lawson, there are others, is one of the most profound gifts to the United States. And whatever he is, compare him to a Solomon Lott. They both have deep religious convictions. They draw on them for different ends and different means. And those differences make a difference. One led to enormous destruction, and responding to Osama bin Laden by a declaration of war and going to war got us what?
Yeah.
Got us what? Okay, Hamas commits atrocities. Okay, go to war. Okay, so now you kill a bunch of people.
We put those patterns into the world, the ones we are using. So it's just perpetuating it somehow, I guess. But how do people take a step? How do we? I mean, to just bring it full circle to try to kind of end. What's your advice, or what's your feeling, or kind of last thoughts just for this conversation? Thoughts about how to, for those who haven't, how do we develop that stance or that orientation, or the one of love that we're talking about now, or the one of taking a step back, like you said, and saying, do I know what you mean? And is it, what's your feeling? What have you seen that is a good way for trying to learn that or help teach that, as you've been doing?
I mean, one of the things that Reverend Lawson helped me to understand, for example, the commitment to nonviolence was not a commitment to passivity. It's not a pacifist. It's an active, engaging in struggle, tempered by certain principles having to do with love and nonviolence and recognition of the humanity of other people. And that takes a tremendous kind of not only understanding, but a kind of patience regarding human development and change, and be willing to be patient and work through things in particular kinds of ways. That is without violence. He told a story once about how when he was during a national movement, they had been on a demonstration. He was walking back to the church from which they had set out to do the demonstration. He got separated from the groups. He was confronted by a group of young white guys who were antagonistic to the march, etc. And so these white guys, and one of them in a motorcycle jacket, walked up and spit in his face. So he asked the guy who spit in his face, he said, do you have a handkerchief? And the white kid said, yeah. He says, may I borrow it? And the white kid gave him the handkerchief. So he wiped the spit off his face and he said, so you're wearing a motorcycle jacket. Do you have a motorcycle? You ride a motorcycle? He said, He says, I ride a motorcycle too. So then they had a conversation of motorcycles.
It's beautiful.
And so
You just
in which he,
switched the
he
context.
handed the kid back the handkerchief, thanked him, and walked on to the church.
That's beautiful. That's a kind of example of what you described too, in terms of the language or the making the positive and negative, or switching the power of, or definition of the word, or the energy of the situation. It's almost like a literal example of that.
Yeah, I mean, so, but in that situation, what are you committed to? If you think that's having someone spit in your face is the worst of NVIDIA's actions toward you that justifies your response violently, but that's not his origin. For him, that is nothing in that regard. And the story of his life was when he was a kid, his mother sent him to the store. He went to the store. Coming back home, he's walking along on the sidewalk. There was a car with some young white boys parked in it. As he got beside the car, one of the boys in the car called him a nigger. So he walked over to the car and slapped his head over it. So when he got home, he told his mother what happened and that he had slapped the kid. And his mother looked at him and asked, and what good did that do, Jimmy? And so he had to walk away and start thinking, what good did that do? But he now had to confront this question of what kinds of actions beget what kinds of actions. And that set him on a road to thinking about violence and nonviolence. His father was a minister, so he's in the church reading the teachings of Jesus. He goes to India to study the teachings. But he refused to be inducted into the Korean War. He's put in federal prison. He comes out, he goes to India as a missionary to study the teachings of John. So he gets set off on this road of what good is violence, and where he begins to think about how do we break the cycle of violence? What can we do to break the cycle? So if somebody spits in my face, they slap. They feel justified in hitting me back. So now we've got this thing to be a dialectic of back and forth, but what's the resolution? Death of one of the others? Or do you say there's a different reaction that calls for a reaction that in fact lays the groundwork for a resolution that embraces the whole rather than denigration or death? It's that of how might we engage in the world in such a way that we break the cycle of violence. Well, then you got to put forward an understanding of people, but you don't engage in. I'm trying to figure out how to take Huck and follow, path I've been on, inspired by him, and having become such a very close friend of his. And I'm still blown away by the way in which he came to regard me as such a profound. We spent a lot of time together when he was back at Vanderbilt over the course of 3 years. We became very close, and the family knows that. And again, he writes down at my death stories, absolutist,
Wow.
Well, wow.
That's a real strong moment in meaning. Maybe you can, if you could share with like where we could find out more about him and your, this. I mean, it would be so I could share it with everyone who doesn't know him. That would be
one of the things I worked on, helped to facilitate, is that all of his papers are now in the archives at Vanderbilt University, and they are all digitized. You can access paper through the Vanderbilt University libraries.
Okay, I'll look for it.
Vanderbilt.edu and the libraries, and James Lawson papers. Also established at Vanderbilt is the James Morris Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Social Movements. There's a whole story about how that came to be and working to help bring that about. So
that's wonderful. Even though I've been reading so much of your stuff, I didn't know about that yet. So it opens up a whole new thing. So thank you. And I am sorry for your loss. However, I do feel like that was obviously something has been given to the world through this, that will continue to be given. And, we didn't even get into, we didn't even talk about so much Africana philosophy and all kind of things from your career, but at least I think we got really deep into this feeling of love, actually, was what it ended up coming to, but of philosophy, why it's important, and
Maybe another occasion, but I thank you for allowing me to spend time with you and talk about all this for your podcast. Thank you.
it means a lot, really. Thank you for sharing your time, and thank you for all that you've given in the world and done, and thanks for, standing on the sidewalk that day and having that thought and following through on it of becoming a teacher and a writer. It means something, and it will continue to mean something. I know you already know that, but, it's good to hear again.
Andre, really
Right.
appreciate it. Thank you, Andre. You take care.
Thanks.
Keep in touch.